Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode in our Introduction to Web Development series. Now, in this episode, we are going to be going over styling. Now, if you remember, styling is created with a programming language called CSS, and CSS is one of the three fundamental web programming languages. If you recall from the previous episode, we talked about HTML, and HTML is kind of like the backbone of websites. It essentially is saying, I want some text that says this, I want an image that has this on it, and CSS goes and takes that and then says, okay, I want to put it here, make it this color, make it this big, and then like I want to move this here, and color everything. It takes care of the styling and making the site look like the site. So yeah, that's CSS's main job, and that's styling's main job. So more specifically in this video, we're going to be going over identification, basic styling like coloring and sizing, and then we're going to be going over positioning. So let's go ahead and jump straight into our code. Now, if you don't have this file, or if you actually created this file but you cannot, like you don't have it open, go ahead and open VS Code first, and then you can come up here and hit File, Open Folder, and then open that folder where you saved this code. And if you didn't create this code, you can go ahead and check out the first and second episodes in this series. The first one specifically is where we installed this program here and we set up our development environment for programming. So once you have this open, this is all the code that we left off on the last episode. So I'm going to go ahead and start up our live server. So if you see this Go Live button in the bottom right, and if you don't have that, recall from the previous episode or from 2 episodes ago, we opened up this extension store and we installed a extension called Live Server. So you can go ahead and check out the first episode if you missed that, and then click this Go Live button down here. And once you click that, it should go ahead and open up a web page, which is our site that we wrote. And as you can see here, we have all of this text here, and those are our heading tags. And if you remember, heading tags are essentially like important text. They mean something more than just regular text on a website. Sometimes they mean titles, sometimes they mean like sections, they can mean a variety of things, and those are heading tags. And you can notice they're all bolded right here. And then of course this P tag here just means paragraph, it means regular text, and that's the majority of text that you see on a website generally. And of course we have the 2 P tags, but this one's in a div, and we're going to get more into how this div is useful a little bit later in this video. So let me go ahead and check this for reference. Right, we're going to start with identification. So one thing I actually left out in the previous episode was the third attribute, or the third element of tags, or the third component rather. So if you remember here, a tag is like everything in here. This is an H1 tag, and you can see that it's an H1 tag because every tag starts with an opening angle bracket or a less than sign, and then the name of the tag, which is one of the components, and then a closing angle bracket. And then that's how the tag starts, and then the tag ends when you do the same thing, open angle bracket, and then the name, and then a closing, except you have a slash before the name, and that kind of means close this tag. So everything right here that I've highlighted is its own self-contained tag, and you'll notice that's true for pretty much every tag. This opening body tag has a corresponding closing body tag. And the only one that's an exception is this doc type HTML, and that's because this is like its own tag generally. And then there's some special tags. In fact, we're going to be getting to one a little bit later where it doesn't have a closing tag, but that's the exception, not the rule. So again, the 3 components of tags are: first, its name. So we call this an H1 or a heading 1 tag. We call this a P tag over here. We call this a div tag, and that is the name. That's what's inside these angle brackets, the H1 tag. That's the first component. And everything inside the opening and closing like kind of components is called the inner content of the tags. So that's the inner content. For example, here it is text hello world, and the inner content gets rendered like you can see here, hello world. And for example, for the body tag, the inner content is all of our website, because the body signifies, hey, this is where we actually put stuff that the user will see, and then everything that's inside the user will see. And everything that's inside the head tag is generally meta information. Like you'll see title document right here. If you'll notice up here it says document. Like this, you put everything that's not seen by the user but that's still important for the website up here in the head, and then in the body is where you put all of the stuff the user does see. So sorry for that little tangent there, but there is a third component to tags. So remember, we have the name, we have the inner content, and then we have something called attributes. And you might already be able to see them here. There's an attribute called lang up here in this HTML. There's an attribute called charset right here. There's an attribute name here. So attributes you create by, if you take a look at this opening tag here, we have an open angle bracket, the name, and then we have a closing one. But in order to create an attribute, we actually put a space after the name before the closing tag. So we create some space in between here and here. And then we name the attribute. For example, we could do name is the name, or we could do like it says up here, we could do content, or it could really be anything. And then we put an equal sign, and then we put some double quotes. And notice they do have to be double quotes, unlike if you watched my previous tutorial series, Introduction to JavaScript. JavaScript, we did use single quotes for strings, but in HTML it does have to be double quotes, which are just the it's the button to the left of the enter key. So what we're essentially saying here is we're creating an attribute called hello right here, and then so that's the attribute name, and then we put in equals and then double quotes, and then what goes inside is the value. So it's kind of like hello, and then it has this value in it. So we can create special attributes for identifying objects or identifying elements. So we can say h1, and then we can actually say ID is, so the name of the attribute is called ID, and then we can set it equal to a double quote here, and then we can say welcome. So all this is saying is, if you'll notice here on the right side, nothing actually changes on our website. That's because usually attributes are like not hidden, but they don't show specifically as text. All this is doing is it is creating an ID attribute and setting it equal to welcome. And what this means in our code is this h1 is now identifiable. For example, if you'll notice here, we have several p tags. In fact, we could actually even have several h1 tags. So hello world 2, and hello world 3. Let's just say I want to make this hello world red, I want to make this one yellow, and I want to make this one blue. Like, how will I be able to approach that? As far as I can tell, without this ID here, let me remove that. Notice these three H1s are essentially indistinguishable, besides that 2 and 3 there. But our code generally does not want to be looking specifically at the text. So really, to our CSS, which we will be writing, it doesn't know, like, how will we tell this one we want to make it red and this one we want to make yellow? Like, it doesn't know. So that's why we need to add an attribute to these H1 tags called ID, and then we can set this equal to red, like our red welcome. And to create attributes, we generally use dashes when we're using like IDs. So we use like red, and then we separate words with dashes, and then we can say like ID equals yellow welcome, and then down here we can just say ID equals what was that, blue welcome. And right, so as you can see, I saved it, and there's still nothing different here, but now these are all identifiable because we can say, hey, I want the red welcome H1, and I want to set that to red, and then now we'll know. So actually, we're going to go ahead and create so that's the first section. And also, we're going to want to talk about classes and IDs, which we are already talking about IDs here. So when you use IDs in our HTML, they are generally for, or they are only for, elements that are unique. So you can't have ID red welcome and then ID red welcome. This shouldn't be happening in our code. We don't want two elements with the same ID, because an ID is supposed to be unique. What we do want is, like, if we do want something or several elements with the same kind of like identifier, we use another different keyword called class. And Notice to create several attributes, we can actually just say class equals and then that, and then we can do another space and just add another attribute, and then we can do like name equals. So you can add on as many attributes as you want, as long as they are all before you close. You do this greater than or closing angle bracket. So let's just say class, and then we can say these headings, um, uh, and then class equals like headings, and then class equals headings. And like I said, notice these three elements can actually have the same class, but they shouldn't have the same ID. And they're used essentially for the same purpose. This is for selecting elements with the class, and this one is for selecting this specific element. So like I can say red welcome, and that'll be talking about this H1. But I can tell my code, hey, I want to do something to all headings. Well, then it'll select all three of these. So that's the difference. So we're going to go ahead and get straight into actually writing our CSS. So to do that, we want to create a new file. So if you are in here, click this new file button. It looks like a little folder with a plus, and then type style.css. Style.css and save it. Make sure this is all in the same folder. Now you can go back to your index.html, and in your head, remember we have the body tag here, and everything that goes inside the body tag is viewable to the user, but we don't want our like style sheet in the body because it's not something that we render, it's something that we use to kind of give our website style. So in order to do that, we type in link and then :CSS. You can usually do that on VS Code. If not, then we can just create a link, and then let me just use this for reference. But we want to do link rel equals style sheet, and then href equals, and then style.css. And notice here, we want to, this is actually one of those special tags that I was talking about. This tag does not have a closing tag. So we don't do a /link. See, it's getting confused. Let me fix that. Okay, so we don't do a /link. This doesn't make sense. Link tag is generally, it's called self-contained. So you just create a link tag and you don't create a closing one, an opening one. So in order to actually fully close the link tag, we just put a slash at the end. So as opposed to doing something like link and then like /link, like we don't do that. We just do one opening link, except before we close it, we put a slash, and that's a self-contained tag. So remember, to create our style sheet, we do link rel equals style sheet, href equals style.css, and then we put a slash at the end. And if we save this and open our style.css, now we can write our CSS in this file, and it will actually affect our thing here. So let's go ahead and start with a simple example, which is coloring. So if you remember, we want to make this red welcome hello world actually red, because right now it's black. So in CSS, in order to target an ID, which we want to do first, we use a hashtag or a pound symbol, and then we type in red dash welcome, which is, if you'll see here, it says ID equals red dash welcome. So that's how we actually select this element to give style to. So in style.css, we say red welcome, or hashtag red welcome, which means we want to edit this text right here. And then we do a space, and then we do some curly brackets. And then inside these curly brackets, we want to type in text, or we just want to type in color, colon, and then red. So if you notice here, hash red welcome, and then open and closing angle brackets, or opening and closing curly braces, and then color, colon, space, red. And if we do that, notice this H1 becomes red, and not these two. Now, let's just say we want to then let's go ahead and do this with the yellow welcome as well. So remember, we do hash yellow dash welcome, which if you'll see here again, the ID was yellow dash welcome. And then we do some color, colon, space, yellow. And if we save this, ooh, it becomes this shade of yellow, which is kind of hard to read. And notice we actually can do RGB as well. If we type in RGB, and then I don't even know, is yellow like RGB? I think it's green and blue. If I do a 0, 255, 255, Nope, that is not yellow, but we're just gonna keep it teal for now. So yeah, that's we can also use custom RGB. So 0 red, 255, which is the max green, and then the max blue. Oh yeah, and then in VS Code, if you hover over, we can actually use a color picker, which okay, so we can do 255, 255, comma 0, and that's pure yellow right there. And then we can do the same with our blue dash welcome, and then we can just do color colon blue. And if you'll notice, we actually probably want to put some semicolons at the end. It's a good practice to put them at the end of CSS lines. So yeah, semicolons at the end. So as you can see here, we now have red, yellow, and blue. That's pretty cool. Now, notice we also use this class equals headings here. We can now select our class. So in order to select a class in CSS, or actually if you remember to select an ID, we use a pound or a hash. In order to select a class, we use a dot. So a dot and then headings. So let me make sure, yeah, headings. And then we do the same kind of format here, and then we can say text dash decoration, which is another type of style, and then we can say underline. And if we save, notice all three of these got underlined, and we only use one style to do it. While for these three, we gave them each their individual colors based on their IDs right here. So that was the basics of IDs and classes and actually styling. And we can also change their sizing. So let's just say we wanted to make this H1 slightly smaller. We can go ahead into this red welcome, and then we can go on to the next line here. And we can just say width is 10 pixels. And actually, let me set the height, 10 pixels. Oh, right, sorry, my bad. So for text itself, usually we want to actually set the font dash size, and then now we can change it to 10 pixels, and that makes it really small. So as you can see here, what we are doing is we are using font dash size, which is setting the font size of the element, and then we are creating a colon and then space 10px, which stands for pixels. Now, that makes it really small, and we can make this bigger, like 100px, and that makes it huge. So like you can play around with that. So that's how you actually size things. We use font dash size, and when it comes to say like a another kind of element like a div, we would use width and height to do that. Just as a side note, but another type of thing we can do is we can actually set a background color. So we can do background dash color, and then we can just say blue, for example. And if I save this, notice that the background becomes blue here. And then if we also set that font size to 10 pixels, that makes it really small, red text in a blue background. And notice that the H1 actually goes across the entire screen. And if I inspect, right click inspect, this is a good way to debug our code. And we take a look at this. Notice that yeah, it kind of goes across. If you click this, select an element, and then click here, you'll notice it goes across the entire thing, and that's just because by default, elements will stretch across the entire screen, and we have to tell them otherwise if we don't want them to do that. Just a thing to keep in note. And in the future, we're actually going to learn how to have elements not do that and only take up the space they need. So that was basic sizing as well, and then positioning. So a quick little HTML, we're going to take a little break from CSS and go back into HTML. A little note on positioning. So notice everything here has like a sort of a fixed space. So we create this and then we create another element and there's this space in between. And then we create this and there's some space in between. We create this, there's some space, some space. There's always some space in between our text. Now, say we want to create some sort of new line. So let's just go ahead and kind of paste this over and over into our text here. And notice it just creates this huge paragraph. Like that's what it's called, a p tag, a paragraph. We can actually introduce a break in this text to give it a space, like hitting enter. So the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. And then right here, we're going to create another kind of self-contained tag. And if you remember, that's a tag that doesn't close. So we type in BR, that stands for break, and then space / close. And that's simple. That's just the BR tag, and it's self-contained. So there's no closing one. We save that, and notice it says the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, and then it creates a new line. And if we actually create two of them next to each other, it creates another space in between this text and this big paragraph. And then if we add a third one, it creates even more space. So that's just a quick thing to note. A BR tag is used for creating, like, it's like if you hit enter and it creates a new line, that's basically what the BR tag is doing. So we just have that. And then the text positioning. So if you remember here, we have this div and then this p inside. Well, let's just give this div an ID really quick. We can just say ID text-div, and then let's go into our style. So we can do a hash and then text-div, and then we can just say we want text-align, colon center. And all this is going to do is it's going to center this text. So if you remember here, this div is kind of like a container, and it doesn't really do anything on its own until we match it with CSS or JavaScript. And now we're matching it with CSS. So we're giving it an ID, and that means we can actually select this div. Now let's say we created some more text in here. So that's one thing. So now all of these texts are centered. So that's one way we can use a div, is it's kind of like a container of this different text. So if we apply a style to the div itself, like we go color colon red, all of the text inside of the div becomes red. So it's kind of like if we apply something to this, it gets passed down to all of the children. So yeah, that's like one use of div, which is pretty cool. And then like, for example, if we did background color, and then we did like black, notice the whole box, this whole box that kind of like surrounds these three pieces of text go black, or we could just do like green, something. Yeah, that looks really bad. Let's go to blue for now. Yeah, so that kind of creates a box of blue background around all this text. So that background color and then using a div is pretty useful. And kind of one more way to select things is we don't have to use IDs in classes. We can also just use elements. And you don't generally want to do this unless you know what you're doing, because when you select an element, you're selecting all of those elements. So for example, if I did h6, so just no dot, no hash, just h6, and then we set the color to green, and actually that's a really bad one, so let's do h4. So notice this little one down here goes green. And the problem with this is if we have like another h4 down here, this is completely random text. So this is also green. So that's kind of a problem, because when we want to select this h4, it's setting every single h4 to this style, to this color green. And we don't necessarily want to do that because we may have a lot of h4s in our text. Now for certain things, like if we want to set the font size of all h4s to like 20 pixels for whatever reason and make them bigger, then that's a little bit more acceptable. So like that's fair. We can do that sometimes, depending on like what you're doing. But like if you're setting the color and you don't want every single h4 to have that color, then you probably don't want to use just an element selector, which is this is an element selector, this is a ID selector, and this is a class selector, etc. So those were the kind of like the basic stylings and selectors for CSS. One last kind of thing before we wrap up the video is if I inspect here, if I inspect element and it lets me, okay, and I click on this little button here, it says select an element in the page to inspect it. If I hover over, notice that there's this blue here, but then there's also this orange on the top and up below. And that orange stands for padding. Now there's something called margin and padding, and that's not padding, that's margin. And margin and padding are essentially extra spacing. So notice there's this red underneath this hello world, and then, or this yellow, sorry, or this orange. And then notice where that orange ends, the next element begins. Same, the orange underneath, the next element begins. The orange underneath, the next element begins. So this padding or margin, the orange is margin, not padding. Margin is green, or padding is green, and margin is orange. And they are basically very similar, but padding is in the inside of an element, while margin is space on the outside of an element. And that does make a difference. For example, when you do padding, it adds extra space inside the element. So when you do a background color, all of that extra space will get that background color. But if you do margin, since it adds space outside of the element, it doesn't. That's just one little example of the difference between the two. And remember, orange is padding. So by default, elements don't have, orange is margin. So by default, elements don't have padding. And that's just a quick little note. And in our style, of course, we can type in padding dash top or padding dash left, or we can just say padding and we can set all sides of padding, stuff like that. And that will change kind of like this space in between elements, which we will probably get to in a future video since this one is running a bit long. So yeah, that has been basic styling. As you can see now, you can kind of like give things colors, position things a bit, you can center them, you can give things backgrounds, you have the toolkit to kind of get a little bit more interesting looking websites, at least compared to before. So yeah, if you want to see future videos in this series, or if you happen to miss any of the previous videos, go ahead and check out the playlist linked in the description, where I'll be uploading daily to this series. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications whenever I post new videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.